The counselor of the Meridian Assembly, a being whose species had lived long enough to watch stars collapse and reform, was not prone to sentiment. Thariel Vass had held her seat for 600 years, had negotiated the partition of 3 solar systems, had witnessed the quiet extinction of 11 civilizations, and had written the official memoranda marking each one as concluded. That was the word the Assembly used. Concluded. It carried a clinical softness that made difficult truths easier to file. Earth had been concluded 412 years ago. The record was precise because precision was the Assembly's greatest comfort. On the 47th cycle of the resting age, the last long-range sensor sweep of the Sol system had returned nothing, no electromagnetic signature, no gravitational anomaly consistent with industrial civilization, no response to the standard broadcast protocols. The planet's atmospheric composition had shifted. The orbital patterns of its artificial satellites had degraded into natural ellipses. The conclusion had been submitted by a junior cartographer, reviewed by a mid-tier analyst, approved without contest and archived. Humanity was gone. It was not a tragedy. It was, in the Assembly's measured view, an inevitability. The species had shown extraordinary early promise, unusual neurological complexity, a strange relationship with cooperative violence, a biological durability that had surprised more than one xenobiologist, but they had also shown catastrophic self-destructive tendencies, internal conflicts over resource allocation, ideological fragmentation, the peculiar human habit of prioritizing short-term dominance over long-term survival. The Assembly had watched 14 other species follow the same arc, and they had cataloged humanity's trajectory with professional detachment. When the silence finally came, it was not shocking. It was merely confirmed. Thariel Vass had personally reviewed the final report when she was still a junior counselor. She remembered thinking it was a pity. Humanity had been interesting, in the way that unstable chemical reactions were interesting, vivid while they lasted, complicated to clean up afterward. She had not thought about them since. The signal arrived during a routine assembly convening, which made it more disorienting, not less. Emergencies that interrupt ceremony carry a different weight than emergencies that arrive in the night. Thariel Vass was mid-sentence in a procedural argument about water mining rights in the Kelvari Expanse when the chamber's primary communications array activated without authorization. That alone was an event. The array required 7 simultaneous authentication codes to activate from outside the building. Someone had provided all 7. The signal was text-based, which was also strange. The Assembly communicated in layered harmonic language, multi-frequency, dense with contextual overtone. Text was archaic, almost pre-technological in its bluntness, but the content of the text removed any confusion about its origin. It read, "This is Admiral Sira Voss, commanding the 11th Consolidated Fleet of the Reclaimed Earth Authority. We are transmitting from 17 light minutes outside your system's boundary marker. We are requesting an immediate audience with the full Meridian Assembly. We are not requesting permission to enter. We are notifying you that we already have." Thariel Vass read it 3 times. Then she looked at the senior communications officer, whose species communicated through color shifts in their skin, and who had currently turned a shade of pale gray that she had never seen before and would later learn had no formal name. It was a color that apparently only occurred under conditions that had no precedent. She called for an emergency recess. The Assembly's outer sensor net confirmed what the message implied. 17 light minutes from the system boundary, moving at a velocity that should have required drive technology the Assembly had not yet developed, were 143 vessels. They were not built in any configuration that matched the Assembly's recognition systems. They were not broadcasting identification transponders in any registered format. They were not slowing down, and at their current approach vector, they would reach the inner system in approximately 9 hours. 9 hours was also how long it took the assembly to stop arguing about whether the situation warranted an emergency protocol, which told Thariel Vass something important about both institutions. She volunteered to receive the delegation personally. Her aide, a young Melvari named Kuresh who had joined her office only 2 years prior, accompanied her to the diplomatic reception station, a large orbital platform positioned as a neutral meeting point between the Assembly's homeworld and open space. Kuresh had spent his short career studying extinct civilizations, which Thariel Vass found quietly ironic as their shuttle docked with the station. He was reviewing what information the Assembly's historical archives still contained about humanity. The files were not extensive. They had been deprioritized long ago, resources reallocated to more active civilizational studies. What the files did contain was instructive, if incomplete. Humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel approximately 3 decades before their silence. They had made first contact with 4 species, all of whom had subsequently reported them as unpredictable but non-hostile, curious to an unusual degree, and possessed of what one report described as an unsettling willingness to accept casualties in situations where other species would have withdrawn. Their biology was notable. They healed from injuries that would be fatal to most comparable species, required only minimal life support in a surprisingly wide range of atmospheric conditions, and experienced pain in a way that, rather than triggering immediate retreat behavior, sometimes appeared to increase their functional aggression. The xenobiological note on this last point was flagged with a marker indicating it had been considered for further study before being quietly deprioritized when the civilization was concluded. Thariel Vass read that note twice and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not quite fear. It was the intellectual cousin of fear, the sensation of realizing that a decision you made with incomplete information may have had consequences you hadn't modeled. The human shuttle docked without ceremony. Admiral Sira Voss was not what Thariel Vass had expected, though she could not have articulated exactly what she had expected. The admiral was middle-aged by human standards, which the Assembly's files indicated meant somewhere between 40 and 60 years. A species with a dramatically compressed lifespan compared to most Assembly members, which Thariel Vass had always found somewhat melancholy and now found differently significant. Voss was not physically imposing. She wore a uniform that was unfamiliar but functional, dark gray with sparse insignia, designed clearly for utility rather than ceremonial display. She moved with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to conserve energy in environments where wasting it had consequences. She had 2 people with her. One was a younger officer who stood slightly behind and to her left, carrying nothing, watching everything. The other was an older man in civilian clothing who Thariel Vass could not immediately classify, and who she would later learn was the mission's senior historian. They brought no weapons, which Thariel Vass initially found reassuring, before she realized she had no way of knowing whether they needed any. Voss sat across the table from her without waiting to be invited, and Kuresh registered a quiet note in his observational log that this was technically a protocol violation, before apparently deciding not to say so aloud. Thariel Vass opened the conversation in the standard manner, offering the Assembly's formal acknowledgement of the delegation's presence and the standard inquiry into the nature of the visit. She kept her tone even, measured the same tone she used for every difficult negotiation, calibrated to project neither anxiety nor overconfidence. It was a tone she had refined over 6 centuries of careful diplomacy. Voss listened to the entire formal greeting with an expression that was attentive but not deferential, and then said, simply and without preamble, We want to understand what happened to us. Then we want to talk about what happens next. The phrasing was so direct, so stripped of diplomatic layering that Thariel Vass needed a moment to process it, not because the words were complex, but because the assumption embedded in them was staggering. What happened to us? Not an accusation, not a demand. A research question asked by someone who had already decided they would get an answer. Thariel Vass explained carefully and honestly the assembly's process. The censor sweeps, the silence, the conclusion, the archive. She did not soften it, because she sensed that softening would be perceived as condescension, and she was already recalibrating her assessment of the person across the table with every passing minute. She explained that the assembly had believed, based on all available evidence, that humanity had not survived its own internal pressures, that the silence of Earth had been interpreted as the civilization's end. Voss nodded slowly, in a way that communicated she was listening but not yet responding, which turned out to be one of the most unnerving human behaviors Thariel Vass would ever encounter. Most species, when receiving difficult information, express something immediately: grief, anger, relief, protest. Voss processed. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We went underground." She said it flatly, the way one states a fact about weather. What followed, over the next several hours, was a reconstruction that Thariel Vass would spend years thinking about. Humanity, in the decades before their silence, had experienced a civilizational crisis severe enough that their surface infrastructure had collapsed almost entirely. The causes were multiple and compounding, the kind of overlapping catastrophes that the Assembly's models had always identified as terminal for species at that developmental stage. But humanity had not concluded. They had descended into their own planet, into hardened underground networks built across a century of intermittent crisis preparation, into systems that produced no detectable electromagnetic signature and were specifically designed to be mistaken for absence. They had not done this as a government decision. No central authority had ordered the retreat. It had emerged from thousands of independent community decisions, built on an infrastructure that had itself emerged organically from a culture that had never entirely trusted that the surface world would remain stable. They had, in effect, collectively and without coordination, gone quiet. And they had stayed quiet for over 2 centuries, rebuilding. Not because they were hiding from the galaxy, though that had been an inadvertent consequence, but because going quiet was what had seemed survivable. The historian spoke for the first time when Thariel Vass asked why they hadn't re-established contact sooner. He was older and spoke slowly, choosing his words with care that suggested he understood their weight. He said that for a long time, they hadn't known there was anything to contact, that the generations who remembered first contact were mostly gone, that the generations who grew up underground had inherited the knowledge abstractly but not the context. That rebuilding a functioning civilization had consumed every resource they had, and external communication had ranked below agriculture, medicine, structural engineering, and, he paused here, child education. He said that last one with a particular emphasis, not as a moral argument but as an explanation of priorities, and Thariel Vass found herself understanding something she hadn't understood in 6 centuries of observing civilizations. They had not been preparing for war. They had been recovering from survival, and they had continued recovering until they had rebuilt not just what they had lost, but something different, something more consolidated, more adaptive, built by people who had lived for generations in conditions that required cooperation at close quarters under extreme stress. The fleet of 143 vessels was the product of that rebuilding. The technology was different from what the Assembly remembered, because it had been developed independently, without access to the broader galactic community, by engineers working within severe constraints. Constraints, the historian noted quietly, that had a way of producing solutions that better resource civilizations would never have thought to try. The drive technology that had brought them across the light years at velocities the assembly's sensors had flagged as implausible was one such solution. It was inelegant, the Admiral conceded freely. It was also extremely fuel efficient, required minimal specialized materials, could be manufactured in facilities without advanced fabrication capability, and had been refined across 80 years of iteration by engineers who could not afford for it to fail. Thariel Vass asked what they wanted. Voss was quiet again, in that particular way, and then said that they wanted what they'd always wanted, which was to understand the universe they lived in. They wanted trade access, knowledge exchange. They wanted the records the assembly kept about them, all of them, including the xenobiological files. They wanted the 4 species who had interacted with humanity before the silence to know that humanity was alive. And they wanted, she paused here, not dramatically, but with a precision that suggested she was selecting words with care. They wanted the assembly to understand that humanity had returned not because they needed permission to exist in galactic space, but because they chose to engage with it. That distinction, she said, mattered to them. The distinction also alarmed Thariel Vass in a way that was difficult to articulate. It was not a threat. It was something more unsettling than a threat. A threat had a vector you could respond to. What Voss had expressed was an orientation, a fundamental position about humanity's relationship to the broader civilizational order, and it was an orientation that placed the assembly not in the position of authority it was accustomed to occupying, but in the position of one party in a negotiation, an equal at best, a junior partner, if humanity's tone was taken at full value. She looked at Voss across the table and asked, as diplomatically as she knew how, whether the fleet outside the system boundary was intended as a demonstration. Voss said yes without hesitation. Thariel Vass asked of what. Voss said, that we're still here, that we're capable, that we came back to talk, but that we came back. She leaned forward slightly. We spent 400 years being concluded. We know what it looks like when something is written off. We're making sure that doesn't happen again. Kuresh wrote in his observational log later that this was the moment the conversation changed, not in tone, which remained measured throughout, but in implication. Because what Voss had described was not military posturing. It was trauma, expressed with perfect calmness. Humanity had been quietly removed from the universe's accounting, had survived that removal in ways that should statistically have been impossible, and had returned not with anger, not with grief, but with a fleet and a clear message that the universe should update its records. The psychological precision of that response, not rage, not desperation, not even the relief of survivors, but the measured assertion of continued existence by people who had learned, at civilizational scale, not to expect anyone else to ensure it for them, was, Kuresh wrote, the most genuinely unclassifiable behavior he had encountered in his study of any civilization, living or concluded. The assembly convened in emergency full session for 3 consecutive days. The debates were long and often heated, which was unusual. Assembly deliberations were typically measured and slow. But humanity's return had disturbed something, not quite fear, not quite guilt, but a third thing that fell between them, related to both. Several assembly members argued that the fleet's presence was inherently aggressive and should be treated as an incursion. Others pointed out that the fleet had done nothing except exist outside the system boundary and request an audience, and that if those actions constituted aggression, the assembly had a definitional problem. The debate about the fleet's technology occupied an entire session, because the honest answer was that the assembly did not have a complete model for how it worked, and the assembly was not accustomed to encountering technology it couldn't immediately classify. Thariel Vass said little during those 3 days. She sat at her station and listened and read. She read the xenobiological files. She read the old first contact reports. She had Kuresh pull every available record of species that had made contact with humanity in the brief window before the silence, and she read those too. She was constructing something, not a policy position, but an understanding. The kind of understanding that had to be built slowly, from multiple angles, by someone who had made an error of assessment and was trying to understand its full shape. The error, she eventually concluded, had not been in concluding humanity. The data had supported that conclusion. The error was in what the conclusion had implicitly assumed, that the silence of a civilization and the death of a civilization were the same thing. That absence of signal was absence of survival. That a species in crisis, by the Assembly's models, would remain in crisis or exit through extinction. The models had not contained a pathway for a species that went quiet as an adaptive response, rather than a terminal one. That pathway had never been coded into the models, because no species the Assembly had observed had ever taken it. The Assembly had 400 years of careful data about species that concluded, and no data at all about species that went underground and came back. Humanity had created a data category that didn't previously exist. She brought this point to the final day of emergency session, and she made it with the same measured tone she used for everything, and the chamber was quiet in a way that it was not usually quiet. Because the implication was uncomfortable, and the Assembly, whatever its flaws, was not a body that avoided uncomfortable implications. It simply preferred to encounter them slowly and on its own schedule, and this one had arrived at speed, at 17 light minutes from the system boundary, in 143 vessels with implausible drive technology. The Assembly voted to accept humanity's request for an audience before the full body. The vote was close. Several members voted against not because they objected to the engagement, but because they objected to the implicit concession embedded in it, that humanity's return, its persistence, its unauthorized development in galactic isolation, all of it had occurred outside the Assembly's knowledge and beyond its influence, and accepting the request was accepting that fact, acknowledging that the universe had done something the Assembly had not modeled. Thariel Vass voted for it. The full session with Admiral Voss lasted 4 days. The Admiral had clearly prepared extensively, which was itself notable. She had prepared not just for the content of the negotiations, but for the form of them, learning enough about Assembly protocol that her team navigated the procedural landscape without significant misstep. The historian, it turned out, had spent years specifically studying the Assembly's institutional culture from available records, preparing for exactly this moment. The young officer never spoke, only observed, and Thariel Vass eventually understood that this was intentional, that the officer was watching not the content of the sessions but the faces, the body language, the moments of hesitation and adjustment, and that this information was being collected with a systematic thoroughness that would have been admirable in an established intelligence apparatus, let alone one that had been rebuilt from near extinction. The terms that emerged were not what the Assembly had initially expected to offer. Humanity did not request admission to the Assembly as a dependent civilization, the category that typically applied to Ray-contacted or newly advanced species, which came with substantial Assembly oversight of development trajectories. Voss negotiated for independent observer status, which carried full information exchange rights and trade access but no jurisdictional relationship. The Assembly had never granted this status to a civilization below a certain technological threshold, and several members argued that humanity did not meet that threshold, and Voss listened to this argument with polite attention before noting that the threshold had been designed with Assembly-adjacent development paths in mind, and that humanity's development path had been. Through circumstances the assembly was already on record as having caused by misclassification, entirely independent. That it would therefore be unusual to apply the threshold as a condition. She did not say this aggressively. She said it quietly, precisely, in the way of someone who has thought about this longer than you have. The assembly granted observer status. Thariel Vass walked with Voss to the shuttle dock at the end of the final session, in a departure from standard protocol that Kuresh again noted carefully and did not comment on. They walked slowly, as two people will when they are not yet finished with a conversation. Thariel Vass asked what humanity intended to do with the access they'd negotiated. Voss said, learn, trade, recover what had been lost, build what hadn't existed. She said it plainly, without grandeur, in the way of someone describing a work schedule. Thariel Vass asked, after a moment, whether humanity had prepared for the possibility that the assembly would not have received them well. Whether the fleet had had orders that extended beyond announcement. Voss stopped walking. She did not look at Thariel Vass with anything hostile or guarded. She looked at her with something that took Thariel Vass a moment to identify, because she so rarely encountered it in diplomatic settings. It was patience. The patience of someone who had considered a question so thoroughly that they no longer needed to perform consideration. They could simply answer. She said, "We prepared for every possibility." That's what 400 years underground teaches you. You prepare for every possibility because you can't afford to be wrong. She said it without threat, without pride, with the quiet weight of a truth that had been learned at enormous cost by people who were no longer alive to be asked about it and had been carried forward because there was no alternative to carrying it. Thariel Vass said that she understood, and she did, she thought, or she was beginning to. She understood that humanity had returned not as conquerors, not as supplicants, not as victims claiming redress, but as something the assembly had no accurate category for, a civilization that had earned its survival in a way the assembly had never required of itself, and that carried that earning in the architecture of everything it had built since. The fleet was not a war fleet, despite what the early briefings had called it. It was a survey fleet with defensive armament, built by people who had learned that defenselessness was a luxury they couldn't afford. The armament was real and it was substantial, but the mission profile was not military. It was the mission profile of a civilization that intended to be present in the universe and had decided, carefully and from experience, what being present would require. Kuresh filed his final observational report the following week. It was longer than standard, and it ended with a note that he flagged as personal rather than official, which was an unusual designation in assembly documentation, but not technically prohibited. He wrote that in his study of extinct civilizations, he had always found a consistent thread, that the species which concluded shared a particular failure of adaptation, a tendency to direct civilizational energy toward competition with their environment rather than integration with it, until the environment became impossible to integrate with, and the species ran out of adaptation space. He wrote that humanity had appeared from the available record to be following that same thread. He wrote that what he had not understood, and what he suspected the Assembly's models had systematically not understood, was that adaptation space was not a fixed quantity, that some species could expand it through means that looked, from outside, exactly like extinction. He wrote that he found this deeply uncomfortable in a way he had not fully resolved. He wrote that he suspected the discomfort was appropriate. Thariel Vass kept a copy of his report in a personal file she did not share with the Assembly archive. She returned to it periodically, over the years that followed, as humanity's presence in galactic space expanded from observer status to trade relationships to the slow, complicated integration of a civilization that had arrived with its own complete history and had no intention of subordinating it to someone else's framework. They were not easy to work with. They were persistent to a degree that the Assembly's more experienced diplomats found exhausting. They asked questions that other civilizations had long stopped asking, because other civilizations had accepted the Assembly's framework for organizing answers. They held positions in negotiations far longer than expected, and then shifted with sudden flexibility that wrong-footed everyone who had prepared for continued resistance. They mourned their dead with a thoroughness that other species found excessive, and they protected their living with a ferocity that other species found alarming. And the gap between those two facts contained something important about them that Thariel Vass could feel but not fully articulate. She read the xenobiological file one more time, years after the initial contact. The old note about human pain response, the one that had been flagged for further study and deprioritized. She sat with it for a long time. It described how the human nervous system, under sustained stress, did not simply record damage and signal retreat. It modeled forward. It incorporated the damage and continued projecting function. The species experienced pain as information about what it was still capable of, rather than as a termination condition. The xenobiologist who had written the note had not been sure what to make of it. It had seemed like a vulnerability. A system that failed to withdraw from damage could be damaged indefinitely. But the note had also observed, carefully, that in the short-term behavioral studies available, the failure to withdraw had never resulted in termination when the organism retained any functional capacity at all. They kept going. They kept going past points where other species stopped, not because they couldn't feel the cost, but because feeling the cost had never been the thing that determined whether they continued. Thariel Vass closed the file. She sat in her office on the Assembly homeworld, 600 and some years old, listening to the quiet of a universe that had just gotten somewhat less predictable, and she thought about a junior cartographer who had submitted a conclusion 412 years ago with all the correct data, and had still been wrong. She thought about the 143 vessels that had not slowed down. She thought about a woman across a table who had said we're still here with the steady voice of someone reporting a geological fact. She thought that the universe had made a common mistake. It had looked at something quiet and assumed something absent. And the universe had had 400 years to become comfortable with that assumption. It would not be comfortable again for a very long time. And somewhere beneath that discomfort, beneath the Assembly's careful institutional adjustment, beneath the policy revisions and the renegotiated frameworks, and the slow restructuring of civilizational models that had to be updated to include a pathway nobody had recorded before, was something that Thariel Vass suspected would never fully resolve. Not fear, exactly. Not respect, exactly. Something that required both words and still wasn't quite described by either. The sensation of looking at a species that had been concluded, and understanding that the conclusion had been the mistake,